Welcome to Significant Brothers. I'm Brad.
I'm Chase.
And I'm Cray.
Today we are talking about Stigler's Law of Eponymy. Stigler's Law of Eponymy basically talks about how what's always discovered isn't always necessarily named after its discoverer. Just like how I found out that I'm not the first Brad, and I was basically named after someone else.
I think, interestingly enough, too, Stigler's Law was named after Stigler, but he was not the guy to first come up with this. It was Robert K. Merton.
I was kind of hoping that he was going to be the original finder of this idea, and it was going to be really ironic. But nope, he's just his own case of himself.
I was going to say, it turns out that's not ironic, yeah.
Yeah, and the other guy who did discover it, it would have been interesting if no one had actually come up with that idea before, so Stigler just names it after some random guy just to prove his point, even though he contributed nothing to the field. It's like, and it's named after my cat, Jeff.
No, the reasons why I wanted to do this is I was trying to think of a reason to talk about another topic that actually isn't covered by this. I thought it was going to, and it wasn't, so I'm saving that one for a different time. I was kind of hoping to find something really dramatic naming rights issue, but I couldn't. But I think at least the one I'm going to talk about, I still think it's an interesting theory or set of tests that I think is very relevant to today's society. So I was like, I could talk about that. It's called the Bechdel test.
I'm not familiar with it.
What is the Bechdel test?
Okay, I was honestly like, they're going to know what the Bechdel test is, and it's going to be bad. You guys haven't heard of the Bechdel test.
Had you heard of the Bechdel test prior to this?
I had, yeah. Mostly because, I took a communications theories class in college, so maybe that's just why I thought everyone knew it. At its core, the Bechdel test is not a women's rights thing, but it's just it tests for sexism and feminism in movies. It first came out in a 1985 Alison Bechdel comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For.
Oh.
Yeah. And the strip was titled The Rule, in which two women who resemble future characters that aren't pertinent to this podcast at all discuss seeing a film. And one of the women are like, I only go to films if they satisfy these following requirements. The movie has to have at least two women in it. They both have to talk to each other. And it has to be about something other than a man. And apparently a lot of movies don't fit these requirements. So it has other names like the Bechdel-Wallace test, which Bechdel prefers because she was influenced by her friend, who was also a karate training partner, fun fact, called Liz Wallace. And it was Liz's idea, so she put it in a comic, and then Bechdel got famous for it.
So Wallace is the original inventor of it?
The reason she invented it, did she publish it in some way, or did she just bring up the idea one time?
She kind of brought up the idea, it was, I guess, if anything, it would fall under Creative Commons copyright. But it's been something that's been, she's the assumed creator of this, even though she's not.
So Bechdel put it in his or her comic strip? Her comic strip.
Her comic strip.
Oh, so that, okay.
No, definitely. It was originally meant to be, quote, a little lesbian joke in an alternative feminist magazine. But then it moved into mainstream criticism in the 2010s and has been described as the standard by which feminist critics judge television, movies, books, and other media.
Really?
See, now that you mention it, I have heard of something similar where it's you do the female characters, if they don't interact, it's kind of very not female centered at all.
There's another way of kind of what you're saying, Chase. And it's called the sexy lamp test.
Oh, that's what I've heard of.
Yep, and basically, if you can replace your female character with a sexy lamp and the story still basically works, maybe you need another draft.
I was gonna say, I wonder if you could argue if you could say, Captain America is about a man, or is it about the idea of justice or something like that? It's could you make that argument?
When someone was doing the report on this in college, they were doing this whole thing, and I posed the question, is it always necessary that a movie needs to pass the Bechdel test? And I don't think it is. I think as a general movie, making a rule, this is a very good thing to have, and it shouldn't be something you're doing just to hit a quota. But she's like, no, it can still be a good movie if it doesn't pass the test. And I'm like, no. It's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, is it necessary that a movie needs to pass this thing? Because some stories like shoehorning a woman in there wouldn't necessarily be good. 127 Days, where it's just Jim Carrey,
James Franco,
stuck under a rock. It's just him. It doesn't pass the Bechdel test. But it doesn't need to pass the Bechdel test because, so like some people, they protest movies that don't pass the Bechdel test. And it's like, I understand why, but that the Bechdel test shouldn't be your only reason for not seeing a movie.
Well, and to be fair to, I guess, 127 hours.
Yes.
Well, if it was a woman in the place of James Franco's character, it also wouldn't pass the Bechdel test.
That's true.
Maybe just that it is an arbitrary guideline that I think people feel more comfortable if, not every movie is just centered around men, but I can see also where it is irrelevant per maybe a genre of movie. I mean, everything has its exceptions.
Yeah. I think everything should, it's like, especially in social theories and communication theories and stuff like that, there should be the point where, this can be broken and it's okay. Like, no theory is completely perfect. It's not like we're breaking the laws of physics here, and that's just revolutionary and terrible. It's like social theories, communications, I think they should have their place where they're allowed to be broken. But it was just it's a simple example of Stigler's law that was really interesting. And it wasn't nefarious. It was just they didn't even want this named after them. It was bequeathed to them.
What I decided to research was the Kasiski examination. Like most of these things in Stigler's law of eponymy, it has nothing to do with copyright. I thought it would because of like two people claiming that
you think it'd be so dramatic.
Yeah, and it's I guess almost by pure coincidence that two brilliant people might come along the same thing. Anyway, so mine's about cryptography. This idea that Charles Babbage, who was a mathematician and a cryptographer, and he was just doodling around one day, helping his nephew with a cryptography problem. I'm going to back up. This took a lot of backtracking on my part because I know nothing about cryptography. I own a textbook. It sits in my room. I don't read it. And so I'm sure you guys are familiar with, like, there was some ciphering that Caesar had, like a certain code that he would write in, and, in the same way that the Zodiac Killer had a thing that he would do. So
wait, Caesar...
Julius.
I know. He... What did he do? He had his own language?
No, not like a language, but a way of covering up like what he wrote. Like it wasn't that clever either. He would just shift letters like to the left and have that letter represent the letter to the left. And then if you wanted to decrypt his message, you would move them to the right. And then you'd be like, oh, this C is actually a D. And then, so...
okay.
Or we do it like 2 or whatever. So it wasn't that, like, that's on the very like smallest level of cryptography, but that's what he did. So this guy, his name's Veneer. He's a French guy. I don't know if I'm going to explain the entire thing to you, but essentially it was a cryptography way of like that dealt with letter frequency, and there's a little bit of arithmetic involved. You'd have like a keyword that you'd compare against a phrase of gobbledygook, and you just write the keyword over and over until it filled up all of the letters in the original thing that you're trying to decrypt. And you would just... It was just essentially adding up numbers and subtracting them. It was slightly better than the Caesar one, but not quite. So Charles Babbage's nephew had a problem, I think, for school, that he was trying to like solve some sort of cryptography thing. I think that involved Veneer's way of thinking, and Babbage was helping him out. And then while he was helping him out, he was like, I've got an even better one. And then he wrote out like, and it worked mathematically. And so he made this thing that is now called the Kasiski examination. But you might be wondering, why is it called the Kasiski examination if his name is Charles Babbage?
I was wondering that.
So it was, well, I mean, you could probably take a guess, but what happened with Charles Babbage is he just wrote this in his journal, and he showed it to some people, and they said, this should remain top secret because this is really good stuff. And because I think it was like higher up officials told him that you have to keep this top secret, he wasn't allowed to publish it. And someone in a different country, Friedrich Kisiski, didn't have the same sort of clearance, and it was several years later, just somehow he also, well, not somehow, but he was actually studying the topic and didn't just stumble upon it like Babbage did, and he essentially invented the exact same idea of cryptography, like to a T. And it was only a few years later. And we didn't know this until exactly a century after Charles Babbage was dead, that they attributed to the wrong guy. But the reason that they didn't know is because he didn't publish it. Kind of tragic, really.
I mean, I guess we have this problem because we're like, well, we have to name it after someone. And we realize that the invention or discovery of something, it wasn't like a standalone event. Usually there's obviously stuff that led up to it. There are researchers that lent a hand to that. Mm-hmm. But you have to name it after someone. You know, sometimes you're just like, yeah, we may as well name it after this person. Why not?
Yeah, if you're like trying to rip off someone's work. But it's like when the idea that if you had a bunch of monkeys in a room typing on typewriters, eventually one of them will come up with Hamlet. And I think maybe like you could argue that how do we know that that's not how William Shakespeare came up with Hamlet? And if that's the case, shouldn't the actual author of all of his works, or at least Hamlet, be called William Apespeare?
It's like, America wasn't named after Christopher Columbus, who discovered it. The sole proprietor of America Discovery.
No.
That's true.
The Native Americans weren't even named after themselves. They were named after someone else named America.
Great. What did you research for this subject?
I researched the Bowie knife. So if you Google the Bowie knife, it's just this sort of long hunting looking knife. Costs like $30 or something. It's a long knife with a blade that's double-edged at the point and a little bit curved. Have you guys ever seen a Bowie knife or heard a Bowie knife?
Yeah.
So Russell T. Johnson, an Arkansas culturist and researcher, said the Bowie knife, must be long enough to use as a sword, sharp enough to use as a razor, wide enough to use as a paddle, and heavy enough to use as a hatchet.
Man,
so
you could get really kinky with that then.
Just in case you're at the cricket pitch and you forgot your bat, you can use your Bowie knife.
But you also know that bowler is kind of a dick, so you want to stab him afterwards. In 1827, on a sandbar in Mississippi, Samuel L. Wells III and Dr. Thomas H. Haddox were about to engage in a duel. It's the normal kind of duel with all the formal rules. You bring your seconds, you bring your doctors, and then you bring, I guess, everyone else who you want to witness it. Jim Bowie was backing Samuel Wells III, and Bowie's nemesis, Norris Wright, was backing Dr. Haddox. So since this is a very formal affair, they did the whole 10 paces and then shoot at each other or count to 10 or whatever they do. So the first time they fired and they missed. So they waited a while and then they did it again. So they do the whole 10 steps and then they missed again. So they resolved this like any normal people would solve it. They shook hands and forgot about the whole thing.
Oh, good.
What?
Did they miss each other's handshakes?
No, they managed to get that one.
Good.
But a brawl between the two parties ensued afterwards. It wasn't really instigated by the two people who dueled, but I guess the other two people were like, I came here for a fight, so, I'm here to kill someone today. So shots were fired, knives were drawn, fists were thrown, and amidst this chaos, Jim Bowie was shot and hit over the head with a pistol so hard that it broke.
Wow.
So he's on the ground, and his nemesis, Wright, pulls out his sword cane and stabbed Bowie in the chest. But when I was reading about this, it said, luckily, the sword was caught by Jim Bowie's sternum, which I was thinking, that's not really caught by anything. That's like, no, he just got stabbed. But while Wright was attempting to pull the blade out of his chest, Bowie pulled Wright down by the shirt and disemboweled him with his abnormally large knife. And then Bowie was shot again and stabbed again, but he still survived the whole affair.
Is it because of his sternum?
Must have been.
The sternum of steel.
That's what they called him afterwards. So the exact account, that's sort of the account that was given in a newspaper. It was very fuzzy because there's a bunch of eyewitnesses with sort of conflicting stories. But the newspapers basically emphasize that this Jim Bowie guy is like a knife fighting legend. There's none like him. He has this abnormally large knife. It's super cool. It's super in right now. He bested multiple opponents, wasn't even injured. So the knife that he used in this fight, it's called the Sandbar fight, was allegedly designed by his brother, Resin Bowie, and smithed by Jesse Clift. But this knife isn't the Bowie knife. It's kind of like a prelude to the Bowie knife. So in 1930, Jim Bowie came to the smith, James Black, with a wooden prototype of a knife that he wanted the blacksmith to design. So James Black did, but he also made this modified version with a double-edged tip, which is the Bowie knife that we think of today. The knives became really popular in the late 19th century, but interestingly enough, they weren't produced heavily in America or by Americans. They were most massively produced in Sheffield, England. They kind of knew how to market to Americans, and they even put like these etchings on it, like "Death to Traitors," "Americans Never Surrender," and the Arkansas toothpick.
What's the Arkansas toothpick?
I guess it was. I think the Arkansas toothpick is actually a different type of knife, but it's. I guess people saw that they would pick their teeth with their knives, and that's why it's called the Arkansas toothpick. I don't know. Those English people, they're smart. So the knife wasn't really invented by Jim Bowie. I think you could argue that it was designed by Jim Bowie, but even the design he was pulling from maybe his brother Resin or from people before that. So James Black really perfected it. It should be called the Black Knife, but that would probably be confusing.
Maybe a little bit. It reminds me kind of, I guess, the reason that people wanted to get them after that little duel was because they saw that the guy who came out on top of the duel had a really cool knife. In the same way that I feel like athletes who are sponsored by shoes, like, people are like, oh yeah, I want those Air Jordans because Michael Jordan has them, but he didn't invent them. And he just endorsed them.
Yeah, it's just like that. You see someone you admire, you're like, I also want to kill people in a duel. So the next time someone pulls a sword cane on you, make sure you take out your Bowie knife. Disavow that son of a gun.
Thanks for listening. You can find us on iTunes. Just search Significant Brothers, or you can go to significantbrothers.podbean.com.
And you can find our newsletter at tinyletter.com/significantbrothers or email us at sigbrotherspod@gmail.com.
And please tweet us at Significant Bros.